Hi, good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine of Politics Prose. And on behalf of the entire staff, I'd like to welcome you here. With exquisite timing, we happen to have a senior member of the Washington Post with us. Dan Balz thought he was coming to talk about his book on the 2012 election. But in the wake of Monday's surprise announcement that the Washington Post is being sold to Jeff Bezos, I would guess that at least a few people here are interested in what's happening and what's going to happen where Dan works. We'll no doubt get to that. But let me just say that whether Dan is discussing the goings-on at the Washington Post or the ups and downs of a presidential race, he has always stood out among journalists for his smart insights, keen ability to synthesize, clear writing, and ever calm and composed manner. At a newspaper that has prided itself first and foremost for its political coverage, there's a reason that Dan emerged in recent years as the chief correspondent. And it's not because everyone else around him either died or retired. I worked at the Post, starting there about the time that Dan did in 1978, and I've seen him in action many times. His thoroughness, fairness, intelligence, and steadiness have long made him an unassuming star. He's been a White House correspondent, political editor, national editor, and became a disciple of sorts of two of the Post's great political writers, David Broder and Haynes Johnson. And Dan has carried on their tradition of unbiased, informed, and must-read coverage. His new book, Collision 2012, Obama versus Romney and the Future of Elections in America, is a follow-on to the book Dan and Haynes Johnson wrote about the 2008 campaign. And as Dan says in the new book, he hadn't expected Obama's second run for the presidency to turn out quite as compelling as the first groundbreaking one did. But it did. The campaign did turn out to be just as compelling, although in different ways. Howell Raines, reviewing the book in the Post the other day, called it, quote, old-fashioned in a good sense, referring to the fact that it's filled with attributed quotes and close focus reportage and thankfully lacks windy analysis. But Dan also shows a modern-day appreciation for the new technologies and social media that the Obama campaign put to such effective use. If you really want to understand why the election turned out as it did and what it portends for America's political future, read this book. Now, we'll be live tweeting tonight's event, just speaking of modern technology and social media. So you can follow along and join the conversation at hashtag DanBalzDC. Dan's going to speak for a little bit, and then we will leave time for questions. If you have a question, you notice the bright lights. We're on C-SPAN, and we're also videoing the event for our own website. So please try to make it to this microphone here so that everybody can pick up your question. And afterwards, of course, Dan will be happy to stay and sign copies of his book. Just given the size of the audience, if you could, not all rush up here at once, but take some time to fold up your chairs and place them against something solid and then form a line that snakes back that way, we'd appreciate it very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dan Balz.
All right, now the windy analysis begins. So, Brad, thank you. It's a delight to be introduced by a former colleague and one with whom I have so much respect, and his wonderful wife, Lissa, when they took over Politics Prose. Sorry. Is the mic there? Hello? There we go. All right. I'm paying tribute to Brad and to Lissa for the great work that they have carried on here at Politics and Prose. As Brad said, we have a new owner at the Washington Post. And at the risk of putting my own job in jeopardy, I want to say, please patronize this store. Buy books here. Whatever else you do is, your business. But this is one of the great bookstores in America, and we want to keep it going. Haynes Johnson and Haynes sadly passed away just before this book was finished. But we were here 4 years ago, I think almost on this very night. And Haynes said something that night that I want to repeat, and that is, there's nothing more gratifying for an author than to come before people who read and like books, and obviously who are interested in and care about American politics. I mean, for those of us who cover American politics and then write books about it, this is as wonderful an audience as we ever get to see. And so I thank all of you for coming out. It's a wonderful crowd, and despite what Brad said, feel free to rush forward with your books. I'm happy to sign them. As Brad said, this book is a sequel to the one that Haynes and I wrote in 2008. And as I started this book, I did have doubts, and as frankly did my publisher, about whether this campaign would produce a story that was going to be as compelling as the 2008 election. I mean, that election, as we all remember, was a historic election, and not only because we ended up electing the first African-American president in history in this country, but also for the epic struggle that he went through to win the Democratic nomination and the economic crisis that we went through, and also in a sense because of how people felt at the end of the election. I remember attending a focus group maybe a year and a half, 2 years after the election. It was run by Peter Hart, who was doing it for the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And he asked people, put yourself back to election night 2008 and tell me what you felt and what you thought. And this was a focus group of Republicans, Democrats, people who had supported Obama, people who had supported John McCain. And any number of the people who had supported John McCain said, I actually felt good after that election. And Peter said, why? And they said, I just felt good for the country. I felt that the country had done something important and significant. And even though I wanted John McCain to win, I felt that something important had happened. We knew that this campaign in 2012 was not going to be that. This was not an uplifting campaign by any stretch of the imagination. It was a totally different one, and it was in many ways a much more sprawling story than we had dealt with in 2008. It had a much bigger cast of characters and an unusual cast of characters, which we'll no doubt talk about tonight. It had a lot of plot twists and some bizarre moments. When the 2008 campaign ended, we interviewed President-elect Obama and said at the opening, before we get to other questions, before you became a politician, you were a writer. He had obviously written a wonderful book, Dreams from My Father. He's a very elegant writer. He said, how would you write the story of your own election? And he said, well, I think it was a novel, and I was not the most interesting character in it. And so he proceeded. So I was thinking, I was not able to interview the president after this election for this book, but I've been thinking, how would he answer that question about this election? I mean, there were times when it was a comic opera, obviously. There were times when it was as serious as we have seen, and moments of tension and anger. My colleague, David Marinis, said to me at one point during the campaign, during the early stage of the Republican race, he said, with all due respect to all of you good political writers, he said, we really need Hunter Thompson right now to be able to explain what's really going on. So this was what I was dealing with as we started out this 2-year cycle from the end of the 2010 midterms until the November election. And yet at the end of it, I thought that it produced a story that not only was as compelling as the other, but in some ways more important. And I say that because I think this campaign was much more of a window into where America has been, a divided America, and also where it may be going, and this struggle that we were in. And also that it is more instructive of this moment in American politics than the campaign was 4 years ago. In some